When we manipulate images from a normal digital camera, quite often what in fact we're doing is battling contrast. Remember that a camera cannot and does not capture the range of contrast that we can see with our own eyes. Very often, one part of the image will require a different level of manipulation than another part, and it's getting those two areas balanced and unnoticed is what gives some photographic enthusiasts a little trouble. Now that is far less of an issue when we shoot infrared images with a converted camera. Now the image we capture is generally far more tolerant of high contrast than conventional photography, and that makes the manipulations a lot easier to accomplish. What we're looking at here are a few thumbnails from a Canon 5D Mark II, which has been converted to capture infrared light. All of these pictures were handheld, apart from the old Vulcan bomber, but that could have been too. To understand why we are looking at thumbnails which have a magenta cast, you need to have read our PDF or watched our other presentation called the options. It's caused by the visible light blocking filter that's now sitting over our sensor. But this cast really isn't an issue, and it doesn't impact on the image quality at all. Now, one thing we are going to need is to shoot our infrared images in RAW mode, because we need the latitude to capture as much contrast as we can. Now this image, as I said, was handheld, and if you look up to the options here, you can see that I was using a 200 ISO, f8 at 250th of a second, using a 17 to 40mm lens set at the 17mm end. With all the manipulations that I make with images, I normally go down to the hyperlink here at some stage. I would be working with 16 bits per channel, and I like to work with my images as smart objects. Smart objects allow me to come back from Photoshop with a double click of the thumbnail in layers and be back into Camera Raw and able to make changes as I see problems or simply when I change my mind. Let's begin the manipulation by removing that magenta cast. We can do that in two ways. If we go to the Hue, Saturation and Luminance slider, we have a little box that allows us to convert to grayscale. And as soon as I tick that box, of course, you can see that's exactly what we get. I tend to use a slightly different method. If we open this image up into Photoshop a little bit later on and decided to put a sepia tone into the picture, then we'd have to convert it to be RGB to be able to do that. With the infrareds I've been working with, I stay on my Basic tab and simply remove the saturation, and it amounts to the same thing. When I begin to make adjustments with my infrared images, I tend to look at the screen mostly, but I use the histogram at the top right of the screen, that mountainous shape, as a guide. Now if we look at that, if I mouse over this particular point, we can see we've got a bit of a deficiency over here, and as I mouse over that you can see the word highlights appear, and on the right you can see the word whites. So it looks like we may have to increase those sliders to improve the contrast. But one of the great things I like to do first is to apply a degree of clarity. Clarity is really good with black and white shots. So I'm going to move my cursor about a third of the way along that travel and click, and it'll jump to that position. If I double click any of these sliders, they'll go back to where they started, which is a nice way to check a before and after. But of course it's doing something, but the image is still a little dull. So let's knock that off. Go to the exposure and move the exposure a little to the right. Now as I do that, you can see the picture brightens up nicely, but it's still a little bit flat. But now I do have that mountainous region in the center, but it appears to be showing me I've still got some problems with at least the whites and maybe the blacks. So let's look at those next. But maybe just before we look at those two, let's try that clarity again. About a third of the way up, and maybe a little more, and we see a certain degree of sparkle beginning to appear into the image. And it's also pushed the histogram a little bit towards the darker tones, so perhaps we don't have to worry too much about the blacks. We can just tweak it a little bit. Not making a massive difference. You can see a difference as I double click and reset, so we could possibly take it down to about there. The whites, well, I can hold the Alt key, and when I click the white slider and move it to the right, I am shown when I'm burning out detail in the image, and when I release you can see that's clearly too far. But that's far further than we ever need to go, because infrared is so good with contrast. If you look up at the histogram, you can see now the light tones all stacked up, which is giving us the burnout we saw when I held the Alt key and clicked the slider. So I can back off. It doesn't matter if we've got a couple of little sparklies there, they're not going to do any damage at all. But I do know that's probably about the limit, but it has improved the contrast no end. Now a little bit of a timeout here, just looking up at the histogram, I can see that the dark tones appear to be a little bit stacked up on the left hand side, which can indicate that we've got blocked up shadows, but looking at the picture we don't appear to have. We've got some strong shadows under here, but I think we need that dark shape to give the shed its impact. And of course the very dark sky is one of the characteristics of infrared. But I can double click the black slider and see a before and after, and to be honest there's not a massive amount of difference between the two. We can revisit these sliders from time to time. I'm just wondering whether I should back off from that plus 56 just a little bit. Maybe just take away the harshness. Looking at the histogram, you see I haven't gone far, so these are small changes, and many of them will be personal. But it has, I think, improved the tonal range of the grasses in the middle distance there, which were beginning to get maybe just a little too bright. But if we wanted to deal with those, we can do that with the adjustment brush. Just before we do, we're getting a nice bit of darkness coming in along the bottom there, which is a nice base for the image, but I'd like to improve on that. I'm going to do that with a graduated filter. Just going to click and drag. Ignore any changes that are made almost automatically, because it depends what you see in these sliders. I can double click that exposure, and now it goes back to where we started. And a nice little tip when we're using the graduated filter and the circular filter alongside it at the top there, or the radial filter, is if we touch the V key, the overlay is hidden, so when we drop the exposure down we get to see the changes we're making, but without the overlay getting in our way. Now that's starting to affect the image nicely. I like that heavier base because when you think about it, we do have a heavy top with that dark sky. Touching the V key will bring the graduated filter back, and of course we can adjust it so it can be tighter or much wider. That's going to be again a personal choice, but I think it's doing a reasonably good job here. Now I think I'm reasonably happy with this image, and I'm going to open this into Photoshop. When the image opens up into Photoshop, if we go to our layers, we can see the normal thumbnail, but rather than seeing it titled as background, we do have a little symbol here, and that's telling me that this is a smart object. So this gives me an opportunity to open this back up into Camera Raw. So at this stage, if we save this image as a Photoshop file, we could come back to it tomorrow, take another look at the image, decide we've got one area too light or too dark, we can double click the thumbnail and be opened up into Camera Raw pretty quickly. We can make any changes that we wish to make. Let's just put a little bit of black on there just for something to do, and when I click OK, what it's doing is updating the image that's already there. But because we're shooting a raw file or manipulating a raw file here, of course we're not making changes on top of changes. The change I've just made has come from the basic raw file. I don't think we need the smart object very much with this particular image. So what I'm going to do here is go to the top of my layers palette and choose to flatten the image. Now we're more or less finished, and we haven't done a great deal of work to be able to bring out the sparkle in that monochrome, and it's rather due to the fact of how well infrared handles high contrast from the middle of the day. Now, just to finish off, there are a couple of tips I can offer here which are not exclusive to infrared by any means, but they're useful nonetheless. We've got a bit of white cloud over on the right, which I suppose some people wouldn't even notice. They're the sort of things I do notice, and I would remove them because it's a bit distracting. Although we've got lots of white foliage here, I find these twigs here a bit distracting. And this little bit of foliage poking in at the top left corner, not enough for it to be doing anything, and I think that needs to be removed. And even these little wispy bits of cloud, not adding much to the picture, but I accept these things are personal. Easy to clone out these things, but perhaps even easier to use the content aware. Picking up my freehand Lasso Tool, I'm just going to draw a simple shape around that cloud there. Going to hit the delete key, and from the fill options that open up, if it's not already there, select content aware from one of these options here. Once you select it, it will remain there. When I click OK, well, Control D removes the selection. It does a super job. I may even be able to use it up here. Let's have a look. Delete, and now I can hit the enter. Control D. I may need a couple of touches of one of the clone tools, but that's no problem. This bit sticking in up at the top left, again, delete. There's the content aware. Hit the enter key. Control D. Pretty simple, isn't it? To bring this to a close, we can have a look at cropping the image. We can look at this and work with the crop tool in Camera Raw if we wish, or we can wait until we get the image completed in Photoshop. I'm going to drop down the top a little bit to put that line there on the horizon, or more or less. We've got a bit of a slope there, and I'm going to live with that slope. It may even be natural. If this was a seascape, of course, we'd make sure that any straight edges were straight. But I'm quite happy with that, and it gives me a slightly more elongated shape, and of course it does show how well this image is composed. The shed is on a part of the image which is very strong, where those two lines cross. The horizon is on the bottom third, and of course we've got the main tree rising up on the right hand vertical. So everything is working in our favour here. And there we have the completed image. It's not very fair to compare this image to the original with just the colour taken out, but it's nice to do it sometimes just to see how much contrast and impact we have applied. Now we do have a 16-bit image here, so at some stage for final saving I would be converting that to 8-bit. But it's a good idea to save your images as you're working through them, particularly when you've got your Photoshop file which retains that smart object. Try to hold on to one of those for a day or two, so that when and if you open this image up a day later and then realize you want to darken the grass in the foreground or make some other change, then you can easily go back into Camera Raw to do that.